The orange Lamborghini sat at the curb under a wash of red and blue strobes, and bent over its hood in handcuffs was a calm black man in a hoodie. His registration and federal credentials lay scattered across the sloped nose of the car where the officer had thrown them without reading a word. A small crowd filmed from the sidewalk. Officer Chad Boone stood behind his prisoner with the bright satisfaction of a young cop certain he'd just bagged a drug dealer in a stolen supercar. What Boone did not know, what he'd refused to check even once, was that the man he'd dragged out of that Lamborghini was a special agent in charge of the Drug Enforcement Administration, that the car and the credentials on the hood were both entirely his, and that the man in handcuffs ran the multi-agency drug task force that Boone's own police department answered to. The narcotics officers Boone worked beside every day reported, up the chain, to the man he'd just pinned to the hood of his own car. Before we find out who the man in the handcuffs really was, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. To understand how a routine traffic stop detonated a young officer's career, you have to rewind about 15 minutes to the moment Victor Hale decided to drive the long way home. Victor Hale was 47 years old, a lean, composed black man with a shaved head, a close silver-flecked beard, and the unhurried, watchful calm of a man who had spent 22 years in federal law enforcement and had seen very nearly everything. He was a special agent in charge with the Drug Enforcement Administration, the senior executive running an entire regional field division, and, among his responsibilities, the commander of a multi-agency drug task force that pulled in officers from a half-dozen local departments, including the one whose patch Officer Chad Boone wore on his shoulder. His days were long and mostly invisible, the way real command is. He read intelligence reports and signed off on operations. He sat in windowless rooms with prosecutors and agents from 3 agencies mapping out networks that moved product across state lines. He answered to Washington, and he answered for the people under him, dozens of them, whose safety on any given night could turn on a decision he'd made at a conference table. He had kicked in his last door years ago. The work now was strategy, budgets, coordination, the unglamorous machinery of dismantling the very trade that had hollowed out the neighborhood he'd grown up in. Almost no one outside that world knew his name. That was fine with him. He had never done any of it to be recognized on a street. He'd done it because someone had to, and because he'd decided a long time ago it should be someone who understood, from the inside, what the work was really for. That evening, Hale was off the clock, coming home from a late dinner, and he was driving the one indulgence a lifetime of hard work had allowed him, a used but immaculate orange Lamborghini he'd bought 2 years earlier and babied ever since. He wasn't dressed like a federal executive. He was in a plain gray hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, the uniform of a man on his own time. His DEA credentials and his supervisor's badge were in the center console. His registration and insurance were in the glove box, exactly where 22 years of doing everything by the book had trained him to keep them. He took the long route home along a quiet commercial stretch because he liked the drive, liked the low burble of the engine, liked the 10 quiet minutes after a long week. He signaled every turn. He kept it under the limit. He did everything precisely right, the way he always did, because he had learned across 2 decades and a lifetime that a black man in an expensive car had to. He had no idea that a board patrol officer 2 cars back had already looked at the Lamborghini, looked at the man behind the wheel, and decided the 2 things could not honestly belong together. Officer Chad Boone was 28, 3 years on the job, and he had built his whole sense of himself around the idea that he had good instincts, that he could read a street, read a car, read a person, and know. In truth, what he had was a set of assumptions he'd never once examined, dressed up in his own mind as a gift. In 3 years, he'd made a great many stops on those assumptions. Black men in nice cars, black men in nice neighborhoods, black men who simply didn't fit the picture in his head of who belonged where. Most of them had gone nowhere, produced nothing, and left the person shaken and angry and unable to do a thing about it. That was the trouble with a habit like his. It was self-confirming and cost-free. When he was wrong, which was almost always, there were no consequences, because the people he was wrong about had no power to make him feel them. He had come to believe his instincts were sharp, when the truth was only that they had never once been tested by someone who could push back. He had no idea that the man in the Lamborghini could, and when the orange Lamborghini rolled through his field of vision with a black man in a hoodie at the wheel, those assumptions lit up all at once. Boone did not think, "Nice car, I wonder what he does." He did not think, "That's probably the owner heading home." In the half-second his eyes moved from the car to the driver, Boone had already written the story. And the story was drugs. A black man, a hoodie, a $250,000 exotic. It did not compute in Boone's head as success. It computed as a dealer's car, or a stolen one, because the idea that a man who looked like that had simply earned it never entered the equation. Every piece of that conclusion came from the driver's skin, and Boone's own certainty about who got to own what. And not a single piece came from a fact. He hadn't run the plate. He hadn't seen a violation. He'd seen a man who didn't match his mental picture of a Lamborghini owner, and to Boone, that mismatch was probable cause. He pulled in behind, ran nothing, and flipped on his lights. It's worth understanding what was and wasn't going through Boone's head in that moment, because it wasn't hatred exactly, and that's the uncomfortable part. He wasn't seething. He was, if anything, a little bored and a little excited. A young officer on a slow shift who thought he'd just spotted something good. A real collar, the kind of stop you told stories about. The assumption underneath it ran so deep and so quiet that he experienced it not as a belief, but as an observation, as simply seeing clearly. That is what makes a habit like his so durable and so dangerous. It doesn't feel like prejudice from the inside. It feels like instinct, like competence, like reading the street. And because it had never once cost him anything, he had never had a reason to doubt it. Tonight, for the first time in 3 years, it was about to cost him more than he could imagine. Inside the Lamborghini, Victor Hale saw the strobes fill his mirrors and exhaled slowly. He was not surprised. 22 years of federal service and a lifetime in his own skin had long since burned the surprise out of these moments. He signaled, eased the low car to the curb, shifted into neutral, and did the ritual he could have performed in his sleep. Interior light on, window down, both hands placed high on the wheel where they could plainly be seen. Then he waited. There was a whole choreography to it that he'd never been formally taught and had never forgotten. The unwritten curriculum every black man in America seems to absorb without a single lesson. Turn on the dome light so they can see your hands and your face. Roll the window all the way down. Put both hands at 10 and 2 and leave them there. Announce everything before you do it. Don't reach. Don't argue. Don't match their volume. Make yourself the least threatening object in the frame, no matter how wrong the stop, because being right has never once been enough to guarantee you get home. He had performed this ritual as a teenager, and he performed it now as a federal executive, and the fact that 22 years and a badge had not retired, it was its own quiet verdict on the country he'd spent his life serving. He did it perfectly, as always, and as always, it was about to not matter at all. Boone approached the window with one hand near his holster, and his flashlight beam sweeping aggressively across the cabin. "License, registration, insurance," he said, his voice hard and clipped. "This your car?" "Good evening, officer," Hale said, his voice a low, even baritone. "Yes, it's mine. I want to tell you before I move. I'm a federal agent. I'm with the DEA. My credentials are in the center console, and my registration and insurance are in the glove box. My hands are on the wheel. You tell me what you'd like, and I'll reach for it slowly." It was, once again, the most careful and complete answer a person could give, and it was the precise moment Officer Chad Boone decided the man was too smooth, and that a dealer in a stolen Lamborghini would of course claim to be a federal agent. What Boone read as suspicious smoothness was, in fact, the most disciplined thing Victor Hale did all night. Every element of it was deliberate, built over decades. He announced that he was armed and a federal agent before he moved, so there would be no surprise, no sudden discovery a frightened officer could turn into a justification. He kept his sentences short and factual. He offered the single easiest path to the truth. Run the plate, call the unit, because that put the answer on a database and a recording instead of leaving it to one man's whim. He was doing, under pressure, exactly what his training and his whole life had taught him to do. And the quiet tragedy of it was that the two sets of training were identical. The federal agent's protocol for a clean encounter and the black man's protocol for surviving one were the same protocol. He followed it flawlessly. And it was not going to be enough, because the man at his window had decided the rules didn't apply to someone who looked like him. Now, here is what Officer Boone could not have known as he stood at that window deciding a calm man was a liar, and what that man had just told him, plainly, and been disbelieved. The person Boone had pulled over on the theory that a black man couldn't own a Lamborghini was Victor Hale, a special agent in charge of the DEA, a senior federal executive who commanded an entire regional division and ran the very drug task force that Boone's own police department fed officers into. The car was his, bought and paid for. The credentials in the console were real, and the chain of command was almost too perfect to believe. The narcotics detectives Boone nodded to in the hallway, the ones he maybe dreamed of joining someday, took their marching orders, through their lieutenant, from a task force this man ran. In the plainest institutional terms, the man in the hoodie outranked everyone Boone had ever reported to by a wide margin. A task force like the one Hale ran is how modern drug enforcement actually works. Federal agents and local officers pooled under one command to go after networks no single agency can touch alone. The local department contributes detectives and, in exchange, gets access, resources, and cases it could never build on its own. Every one of those local detectives, when assigned, effectively works for the task force commander for the duration. Boone had spent 3 years wanting into exactly that world, imagining the day he'd trade his patrol uniform for a detective shield and a spot on a real narcotics unit. The man he just cuffed was the person who would, in effect, have signed off on that. He had, without the faintest idea, insulted the top of the very ladder he dreamed of climbing. And it got worse, because a single call would have proven all of it. Running the plate would have returned a car registered to Victor Hale, clean, no wants, never stolen. Reading the credentials would have shown a federal badge. Radioing it in would have, within minutes, reached people who knew exactly who Victor Hale was. Every safeguard built into the job to prevent this exact mistake was one small action away, and Boone was about to skip every one of them. That is the quiet design of a traffic stop, when it's done right. It is built so that an officer's assumptions never have to be the deciding factor. The plate check exists, so you don't have to guess whether a car is stolen. The credential exists, so you don't have to guess whether a claim is true. The radio exists, so you can reach people who know things you don't. Every one of those tools is there precisely to catch the moment when a cop's gut is wrong, which is often. Boone had all of them within arm's reach, and he used none of them because using them meant admitting his certainty might be mistaken. And his certainty was the one thing he was unwilling to question. The tools were never the problem. The problem was a man who'd rather be sure than be right. That is the quiet, almost unbelievable gravity of what you're watching. A young officer had chosen, out of nothing but the sight of a black man in a nice car, to arrest the single person most catastrophic for him to be wrong about, a federal executive who sat, in effect, at the top of the very structure the officer belonged to. And he was about to do it on his own body camera with a street full of phones recording. If you already know this is going to be a disaster for this officer, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button and subscribe, because the moment this stop collides with who the man in the Lamborghini actually is, is coming fast, and it lands hard. There was another reason this stop cut especially deep, and it had a name: Terrell Boyd. Terrell was 24, a young officer newly assigned to that very drug task force, one of the local cops working under Hale's command structure. And he was also a black man who drove a modest car and had, 3 weeks earlier, been pulled over by this same Officer Boone for matching a description that turned out to be nothing at all. Boone had made him wait 20 minutes and had spoken to him the whole time like a suspect, uniform and badge notwithstanding, before letting him go without an apology. It had happened at night, on a quiet street, with no one around to see. Boone had come up on him the way he came up on everyone he had already decided about, fast, hard, one hand near his belt, and had grilled him about where he was going and where he'd been and whether the car was really his, in a tone that made the answers irrelevant. Terrell had shown his own badge, watched the officer study it with visible disappointment, and been sent on his way with a curt nod. He'd sat in his car for a minute afterward, his hands not quite steady, feeling the particular exhaustion of being made a suspect by a man who wore the same uniform he did. He hadn't reported it. He'd told himself it wasn't worth it, that nothing would come of it, that a rookie complaining about a fellow officer only painted a target on his own back. He'd folded it down and carried it, the way he'd carried the others. Terrell had mentioned it quietly to no one who could do anything about it, and had swallowed it the way he'd swallowed a dozen like it. He had no idea that the man Boone would pull over next was the commander at the top of his own task force. And across the street, mounted above the door of an all-night convenience store, a security camera watched the whole thing unfold, its lens catching the Lamborghini, the strobes, and the officer at the window, recording steadily as, on the sidewalk, the first phones came up. "Get the paperwork," Boone said. "Slow." Hale reached slowly and deliberately into the glove box and drew out a folder, registration, insurance, all of it neatly organized, and then, with the same care, opened the center console and lifted out a black credential case. "This is my registration and insurance," he said, holding out the folder, "and this is my DEA credential. I'm a special agent in charge. I'd ask you to look at both." Boone took the folder and the credential case, and here was the last clean off-ramp of the entire night. All he had to do was open the case. All he had to do was read the registration, or run the plate, or key his radio. Any one of them ended it. He did none of them. He gave the credential case a single dismissive glance without opening it, decided a dealer would have a fake one, and tossed both the folder and the case onto the sloped hood of the Lamborghini, where the papers fanned across the orange paint. "Out of the car," he said, pulling the door open. "Hands where I can see them." Hale did not argue. He knew with the bone-deep certainty of experience that the curb was not where this got won, that the fight, if there was one, happened later, on the record, with the truth. So he unfolded himself from the low car, calm and unresisting, hands visible the entire time. And Boone, reading the man's very composure as arrogance, turned him around, pressed him down over the hood of his own Lamborghini, and pulled his arms behind his back. The cuffs ratcheted shut a notch too tight, biting into the wrists of a federal executive as he lay bent over the hood of his own car. His own credentials scattered inches from his face. There had been one heartbeat in the middle of it that only one of the two men understood was dangerous. When Hale had first mentioned his credentials and his federal status, Boone's hand had twitched toward his own weapon, the reflex of a man hearing something that didn't fit and defaulting to fear. In that half second, a career's worth of encounters that had ended in gunfire flickered through Hale's mind, and he did the thing 22 years had trained into his body. He went still, hands high and open, and let the moment pass without giving it a single thing to catch on. A younger man, or a more frightened one, might have moved wrong, and moving wrong was how these nights turned into headlines, with a very different ending. Hale did not move wrong. He never did. It should not have required such expertise simply to survive being right. "You're being detained on suspicion of grand theft auto and narcotics," Boone announced, loud and clear, for the camera on his chest. "There's no way you paid for this car." He said the quiet part out loud, on tape, and on the sidewalk a man watching swore softly and lifted his phone higher. Hale didn't struggle. He turned his cheek against the hood, kept his voice level, and began, with the flat precision of a man who had built federal cases for 2 decades, to lay down the record. "For the camera," Hale said. "My name is Victor Hale. I am a special agent in charge with the Drug Enforcement Administration. This car is registered to me. My credentials and my registration are on the hood in front of me, where this officer threw them without reading them. He has not run the plate. I have committed no crime. I am being detained on camera over the hood of my own car, and I want every second of this preserved." He paused and added evenly, "I would also advise you to call your own narcotics unit before you go any further. You're going to want their lieutenant here." "Yeah, I bet I do," Boone said, missing it entirely, and keyed his radio to call for a tow truck to impound the stolen Lamborghini. If you already know this officer just ended his own career, hit like and subscribe, because the person who's about to arrive and recognize the man on that hood is going to make it unforgettable. The first vehicle to arrive was a supervisor's unit, and out of it climbed Sergeant Rick Vance, a 19-year veteran who had learned to be deeply suspicious of confident young officers making dramatic arrests. He had been close by when he heard Boone call in a grand theft stop on an exotic, and something about it had made him turn the car around, because a stolen Lamborghini did not usually get driven at the speed limit with the dome light on. Vance took in the scene as he walked up. A man cuffed over the hood of a pristine Lamborghini, calm as still water. Credentials fanned across the paint. A crowd of phones on the sidewalk, and his young officer looking pleased with himself. 19 years told him, before he knew a single detail, that this was wrong. "Boone," he said, "what do you have?" "Grand theft auto, maybe narcotics, Sarge," Boone said. "Black guy in a hoodie driving a $200,000 Lambo. Gave me a whole story about being a federal agent. No way it's his." Vance's eyes dropped to the credential case on the hood. He picked it up and flipped it open and went very still. Then he keyed his radio and read the plate and waited, and it came back in 20 seconds. Registered to Victor Hale, clean, no wants, not stolen. Everything the man bent over the hood had said was, in cold data over the radio, simply true. But it was the second vehicle that turned the night from a bad mistake into an unforgettable one. A dark, unmarked sedan pulled up fast, and out of it stepped Lieutenant Dana Ford, the commander of the police department's own narcotics unit, a woman who spent a significant part of every week in task force meetings, reporting up a chain of command that ended at a DEA special agent in charge. She had heard the stop go out over the radio, and something about the location and the description had put a knot in her stomach, and she had come to see for herself. She walked up, looked at the man cuffed over the hood of the Lamborghini, and the blood drained straight out of her face. "Oh my God," Ford breathed. "That's Boone. What have you done? That's SAC Hale. That's Victor Hale. He runs the task force. He runs our task force. He is my chain of command." She was already moving. "Get those handcuffs off him. Get them off him right now." Boone stood frozen, the impound tow he'd just called suddenly the least of his problems as the reality assembled itself in front of him. The man he'd thrown over the hood as a hoodie-wearing car thief was a senior federal executive, and the lieutenant who ran his own department's drug unit had just called him her chain of command, and all of it was being recorded. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown, and phones were up now, capturing angles Boone's own camera never would. The mortified lieutenant, the grim sergeant unlocking the cuffs, the calm federal agent gathering his credentials off the orange hood, the young officer frozen with the reality landing on him in waves. By the next day, some of that footage would be online, and the story it told needed no caption. A special agent in charge of the DEA thrown over the hood of his own car and called a thief because a cop couldn't believe a black man had earned a Lamborghini. But in that moment, Boone wasn't thinking about the cameras. He was thinking about the phrase interfering with a federal agent, and about the fact that the woman who ran his department's drug unit had just, in front of everyone, called the man he'd cuffed her boss. Sergeant Vance already had his key out. He unlocked the cuffs himself and eased Victor Hale upright off the hood of his own car, the steel leaving raw red bands on the federal executive's wrists. On the sidewalk, when the cuffs came off and the man everyone had been filming straightened up and calmly gathered his credentials off the hood, a low sound moved through the crowd, not quite a cheer, more a collective exhale, the sound of a dozen strangers who just watched something wrong start slowly to be set right. Someone said, "He's a federal agent, that's his own car." And the murmur spread, and the phones stayed up, because now they were recording the correction as carefully as they had recorded the crime. Neither supervisor tried to wave the cameras down. Vance, the veteran, understood what his younger officer never had. The recordings weren't the enemy. They were the only reason the truth had a fighting chance. "Agent Hale," Vance said, low and grim. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Vance. There's no word for how sorry I am. This was wrong, top to bottom." Hale rolled his shoulders, gathered his scattered credentials and registration off the orange hood with an unhurried, deliberate calm, and slid the badge back into its case, including, in plain view, the federal shield the young officer had refused for 10 minutes to look at. Victor Hale did not raise his voice. He rubbed the welts on his wrists once, straightened his hoodie, and turned to face Officer Chad Boone with a calm that was far heavier than anger. "Sergeant Vance, Lieutenant Ford, I want a few things on the record, and I want them now," he said. "A preservation order on this officer's body camera and dash camera, effective immediately. Nothing deleted, nothing overwritten. The computer log showing when he finally ran my plate, which was after he cuffed me, and the security footage from that store across the street, which caught all of it. There are a dozen phones on that sidewalk, too. I want it all secured before a single word of a report gets written, because I have spent 22 years watching stops like this one get rewritten by the person holding the pen, and it is not going to happen with this one." "It's already flagged, sir," Ford said quietly, her face still ashen. Then Hale turned to Boone, and when he spoke to him, there was no heat in it, which made it land harder than any shout. "Officer Boone, I told you what I was 4 times. Hale said. "I told you I was a federal agent. I told you my credentials and my registration were right there. I told you to run the plate, and I told you, specifically, to call your own narcotics unit before you went any further. You heard all of it, and you decided none of it could be true, because a black man in a hoodie could not possibly own the car he was driving." He paused. "Here is something you should understand about the mistake you made tonight. Lieutenant Ford runs your department's drug unit. She reports through her chain to a task force. I command that task force, which means the narcotics detectives you work beside, the ones you probably want to be someday, ultimately answer to me. You didn't just profile a stranger tonight, officer. You threw the man at the top of your own house over the hood of a car and called him a thief because you couldn't imagine he'd earned it." Boone's mouth opened and closed. There was nothing to say that the plate, the credentials, the lieutenant, and his own camera hadn't already said for him. "And the worst part," Hale went on, quieter still, "isn't even what you did to me. I'll be fine. It's that 3 weeks ago you did a smaller version of this to a young officer named Terrell Boyd, one of Lieutenant Ford's people, one of mine, for matching a description. You have a habit, officer. Tonight it just finally found someone it couldn't be buried on." The name landed on Ford, who closed her eyes for a second because she knew Terrell, and she hadn't known. Terrell Boyd was one of hers, a promising young officer she had personally recommended for the task force, quiet and careful and easy to overlook, the kind of kid who never made noise about anything. She thought about him coming to work every day beside a man who had pulled him over and treated him like a criminal and saying nothing because he'd decided nothing would come of it. She thought about how many times that calculation had been made, by how many young officers, about how many complaints, and how often it had been correct. And she made a quiet promise to herself standing on that curb next to her handcuffed commander, that Terrell's silence was going to end tonight, and that she was going to be a lieutenant who made speaking up worth the risk instead of a reason for it. As if to underline the whole thing, the tow truck Boone had called to impound the stolen Lamborghini rumbled up to the curb right in the middle of it, amber lights joining the strobes, the driver leaning out to ask which car he was hauling. Sergeant Vance waved him off with a short, tired gesture. "Cancel it," he said. "There's no stolen car here. There never was." The driver shrugged, killed his lights, and pulled away. And the sight of an impound truck arriving to seize a federal executive's own Lamborghini and then leaving empty was, for the crowd on the sidewalk, the perfect small picture of the entire night. A whole machine set in motion to take something from a man on the assumption it couldn't be his, every part of it wrong. Hale did not perform his vindication. He didn't demand an apology in front of the crowd or savor the young officer's collapse. He gathered the last of his papers, checked that his car was undamaged, and let the supervisors do their jobs. Lieutenant Ford, mortified, offered to have someone drive him home. He thanked her and declined, and said only that he'd handle the rest through the proper channels, and that she should go check on Terrell Boyd. Then he got back into his Lamborghini and drove the rest of the way home, because that was all he'd been trying to do in the first place. He drove the last few miles slowly, the engine a low murmur under him, the streetlights sliding across the orange hood, and he let himself feel, privately, the thing he never showed on a curb. The tiredness of it. Not fear. He'd burned through fear decades ago, but a bone-deep weariness at the sameness of it, at the fact that he could be a special agent in charge with 22 years and a chest full of commendations and still end a Tuesday night bent over the hood of his own car for the crime of owning it. He thought about the young agents and officers he mentored and about what he'd tell them tomorrow and about how tired he was of having anything to tell them at all. Then he pulled into his own driveway, sat for a moment in the dark, and let it go. Folded it down small the way he always did, because there was work in the morning, and the work was bigger than the insult. It always had to be. But this was not going to be handled with an apology on a curb, and everyone with any sense knew it. The internal investigation began within the day, and it did not take long because the evidence was overwhelming and came from every direction. Boone did the thing officers in his position always try. He wrote a report telling a different story than the one that happened. In his version, the driver had been evasive, had made statements inconsistent with lawful ownership, had displayed indicators consistent with narcotics activity, requiring detention. It was the familiar language, the language that had smoothed over 100 bad stops before his. He was betting, as such officers always bet, that his account in a report would carry the day. But this time, the report had to survive his own body camera, and it didn't. The footage showed Victor Hale calm and cooperative from the first word, identifying himself as a federal agent repeatedly, offering his credentials and his registration, telling Boone plainly to run the plate and to call the narcotics unit. It captured Boone tossing the credentials onto the hood unread, and it captured in crisp audio the sentence that would follow Chad Boone for the rest of his life. "There's no way you paid for this car. There was no evasion on that tape, no indicators of anything but a man telling the truth." The gap between what Boone wrote and what his own camera showed did not just sink the incident. It branded him a man who would put a lie in an official report, which follows an officer everywhere. In the interview room, when investigators played the footage for him, Boone tried at first to hold the line. Instincts, officer safety, a rapidly evolving situation, the whole worn script. Then the video reached the part where he tossed a federal credential onto the hood without opening it, and the investigator paused it there and asked a single quiet question. "At what point did you consider that the man telling you he was a federal agent might be telling the truth?" Boone had no answer because the honest answer was never. He had never considered it, not for 1 second, because the man was black and in a hoodie and a car Boone had decided he couldn't own, and Boone's mind had closed around a verdict before he'd left his cruiser. He couldn't say that out loud. The silence in the room said it for him. And then there was the pattern. When investigators pulled Boone's history, the Lamborghini stopped looking like a single bad call and started looking like a habit. There was the stop of Terrell Boyd 3 weeks earlier, a fellow officer pulled over and treated like a suspect for matching a description. There were other stops too, drawn from a file that had been quietly accumulating, a string of detentions of black men in nice cars or nice neighborhoods, each one justified in writing with the same vague, elastic language about suspicion, each one producing nothing. And here was the part that widened the case from one officer to a system. Those reports had not written and approved themselves. Each one had crossed a supervisor's desk and been stamped and filed without a second look. The elastic language doing exactly what it was designed to do, making a bad stop legible as a lawful one to anyone not inclined to look closely. Boone's habit had survived 3 years, not because it was hidden, but because the machinery around him had never once been curious about it. It had taken a federal executive, a rolling body camera, and a street full of phones to make the department finally read what had been sitting in its own files the whole time. Individually, every one of them had been easy to wave away. Lined up together, next to a video that showed exactly how Boone behaved when he thought no one important was watching, they told a single damning story. The Lamborghini stop hadn't created the problem. It had just, for the first time, been caught on enough cameras and involved a man important enough that the problem could no longer be filed away. The findings were not survivable. Unlawful detention. Failure to verify readily available identification and registration. A biased statement captured on his own camera. A false official report. And, hanging over all of it, the fact that he had detained a federal agent and interfered, however briefly, with a senior DEA official going about his lawful business, a fact that drew the interest of people well above the local department. The DEA does not shrug off one of its senior executives being thrown over the hood of a car and accused of narcotics trafficking by a local patrolman. A report went up the federal chain. Questions were asked in writing by people whose questions a city department cannot afford to answer badly. It was the same lesson these stories always seem to teach. The moment the person wronged turns out to have real institutional weight, the machinery that so reliably protects an officer like Boone simply stops being the machinery in charge. The union that would have fought for him in an ordinary complaint took one look at the footage and the federal involvement and declined to spend its capital on a case that clean. Officer Chad Boone was terminated for cause. There was a civil rights claim that the city, staring at the same video everyone else had seen, had no appetite to fight, and it settled for a substantial sum. Hale did not need the money and said so plainly. He directed the bulk of it to a legal aid fund that helped people without his resources fight exactly this kind of stop. The ones with no dealer plates, no federal badge, no lieutenant who'd vouch for them, whose word was all they had against an officer's. It was, he told the few people he explained it to, the only part of the whole business that interested him. The settlement was just money moving from one municipal account to a private one. What he cared about was making sure that the next man in a hoodie who got thrown over a hood had a lawyer and a chance and a record, the things Hale had been lucky enough to carry in his own glovebox, and most people weren't. At 28, 3 years into a career he'd used to decide who was allowed to own what, Chad Boone was finished wearing a badge, and because the termination was for cause and documented on video, no other department was going to touch him. There was a particular, bitter irony to it that was not lost on anyone in the building. Boone had spent his short career imagining himself as a future narcotics detective, a real drug warrior, and he had ended that career by throwing the actual commander of the region's drug war over the hood of a car because he couldn't believe a black man had earned a nice one. The very world he'd wanted to belong to was the world he'd insulted in the person of the man who ran it. There were people who came out of that night having done the right thing, and it was worth marking them because the difference between them and Boone was the whole point. Sergeant Vance had turned his car around on nothing more than an instinct that a calm man in a slow-moving exotic didn't add up to a thief, and when the plate came back clean, he hadn't hesitated or tried to protect his own officer. He'd unlocked the cuffs himself. Lieutenant Ford had recognized her own commander and said so instantly out loud in front of everyone, when it would have been easier to quietly let the machinery grind on. Neither of them was a crusader. They were simply willing, in the crucial second, to see what was actually in front of them instead of the story the uniform expected. That willingness was the entire thing Boone had lacked, and it had cost him everything and cost them nothing. Those who knew Victor Hale understood the discipline it had taken to stay so calm over the hood of the car and where it came from. He had grown up poor, in a neighborhood the drug trade had hollowed out, and he had watched it take people he loved. He had joined the DEA not out of some abstract ambition, but because he'd decided, young, that he wanted to be on the side that fought back, and because he believed the agencies doing that, fighting badly needed people who understood, from the inside, the communities they operated in. He had climbed for 22 years, from a street agent kicking in doors to a special agent in charge running a division, and every rung of that climb, he had done the same careful thing, hands visible, voice level, everything announced, because a black man in America did not get to relax that vigilance no matter how high he rose. The Lamborghini was the one thing he'd let himself have. He'd bought it used, obsessed over it, and driven it with a quiet, private joy that had nothing to do with showing off and everything to do with a poor kid who'd made it. He remembered being 12, watching a car like it rumble past the corner where he grew up, and feeling the specific ache of wanting something the world had already decided wasn't for him. He remembered the men in his neighborhood who chased that feeling the fast way through the trade he now spent his life dismantling, and how many of them were dead or gone. He had chased it the slow, hard, legal way instead for 35 years, and the orange car in the driveway was the proof to a 12-year-old ghost that the slow way could work. That was what Boone had looked at and called stolen, not a rich man's toy, a poor kid's receipt, earned across a lifetime of exactly the work Boone claimed to admire. The insult wasn't just that Hale had been accused of a crime. It was that the officer had looked at the single most honest thing Hale owned and seen a lie. And the night on the curb had told him, all over again, the thing he already knew, that to a certain kind of eye, the car didn't read as the reward for a life of hard, dangerous public service. It read as a crime. 22 years and a federal command had not bought him out of that. He carried the knowledge the way he carried everything, without drama, folded down small. What he thought about afterward was not Boone. Boone was a known quantity now, a problem the system would handle. What he thought about was the version of that stop where the officer was more frightened, or where a younger man than himself had reacted a half-second wrong, or where the hand reaching for a suddenly declared weapon met a hand that flinched. He had survived 100 stops on the strength of a discipline most people should never have to build. And he thought, as he always did, about the ones who didn't have 22 years of it to draw on, the ones for whom a night like his ended not with a settlement, but with a funeral. That was the thought he couldn't put down. Not what had happened, what could have. There was one thread from that night that mattered to Victor Hale more than the investigation, and it was the young officer he'd never met but had defended over the hood of his own car. Terrell Boyd had been stopped by Boone 3 weeks earlier and had swallowed it, the way he'd swallowed others, because he was 24 and new, and didn't think anyone would take his word over a fellow officer's. When the story of the Lamborghini stop moved through the task force, and Terrell realized that the commander at the top of his own chain had named him, had known, somehow, and had set his name into a body camera as evidence of a pattern, something shifted in him. He gave a full statement to the investigators about his own stop. It became one more brick in the case against Boone. It was not an easy thing for him to do. Testifying against a fellow officer, even a bad one, is the exact act every young cop is quietly warned against. The thing that gets you frozen out, labeled, left without backup on a bad night. Terrell knew all of that. He did it anyway because the commander at the top of his own chain had said his name into a camera as if it mattered, had treated a thing Terrell had swallowed in silence as evidence worth entering into the record, and that had changed something. For the first time, speaking up hadn't felt like painting a target on himself. It had felt like being seen. And once a person has felt the difference, it is very hard to go back to swallowing it. But Hale did more than use the young man's story. He sought Terrell out. He told him the truth about his own path, the neighborhood, the losses, the choice to join the fight anyway, the lifetime of hands-visible vigilance that not even a federal command had ended. He told Terrell that the work needed people exactly like him, precisely because they knew what it felt like to be on the wrong end of a bad stop, and that the way you answered a Boone was not to leave the profession to the Boones, but to become the kind of officer, and eventually the kind of commander who made sure it happened less. He became quietly a mentor. He watched the younger man's career the way someone had once watched his. A couple of years later, Victor Hale was still running his division, still driving his Lamborghini home the long way when he felt like it, still doing the hands-visible ritual at every stop because the world still required it. A few days after the stop, Victor Hale did something he rarely did. He let it be public. He did not rage on camera or turn himself into a symbol, but when the bystander videos spread and reporters came asking, he gave a short, measured statement. Standing in front of a wall, he chose deliberately, not a DEA seal, just a plain background. He told the story plainly, and then said the thing he most wanted people to hear, that he had a federal badge and a registration and a lieutenant who knew his face and cameras from 6 directions, and that he had still ended up over the hood of his own car, and that almost no one this happened to had any of those things. "Don't let it end at me," he said. "I'm fine." Think about everyone this happens to who can't prove who they are to a man who's already decided. The comment sections filled with people describing their own versions, and for a while, a viral clip of one man's humiliation became something closer to a national conversation. Chad Boone was gone from law enforcement for good, his firing and his settlement a matter of record, a name in a training file. And Terrell Boyd had moved up, off patrol and onto the task force in earnest, on the first rungs of the climb Hale had made before him, carrying a lesson he'd learned the hard way and then seen answered. That the man they had all been taught to see as a suspect had turned out to be the one running the whole fight, and that the surest reply to being underestimated was to rise until you were the one deciding who got seen. The department did not simply fire one officer and move on either. The footage was too clean and the federal attention too serious for that. Boone's body camera video became a training case, shown to officers as the textbook example of a stop gone catastrophically wrong when a cop decides who someone is before gathering a single fact. The elastic language that had papered over his reports got new scrutiny. Supervisors were reminded, pointedly, that their signature on a use of force or detention report was supposed to mean they had actually looked. None of it was a revolution. But it was the machinery, for once, being made curious about itself, and that was more than a habit like Boone's had ever had to survive before. And that's the thing to carry out of this one. Not a single second of what happened on that curb had to happen. All Officer Boone had to do, at any point, was one small thing. Run the plate, open the credentials, call the narcotics unit the man specifically told him to call. 30 seconds of checking instead of assuming would have ended it before it started. A hoodie instead of a suit. A black man in an expensive car who must have stolen it instead of the federal executive who had earned it. That was all the evidence he needed to throw a man over the hood of his own Lamborghini and call him a thief. Here's the truth underneath it. Victor Hale didn't deserve to be believed because he turned out to run the DEA task force. He deserved it because he was telling the truth, and because the burden should never have been on him to prove he wasn't a criminal for the crime of driving a nice car while black. He got his justice because he had a federal badge, a registration in the glove box, a lieutenant who knew his face, and cameras from 6 directions. Strip those away, and he's just a man in a hoodie whose word means nothing against a badge, which is exactly where most people in his position actually stand. That was the part Hale kept returning to in the days after. Not the indignity of his own night, he'd survived worse and would again, but the arithmetic of it. He had walked away with his dignity in a settlement because he'd been, that night, impossible to dismiss. A federal badge, a clean plate, a lieutenant, 6 cameras. Take away any one of those, and the story bends darker. Take away all of them, as they are taken away for most people, and the calm man over the hood is simply a suspect. And the officer's report is simply the truth. And no one ever makes a video about it, because nothing about it was unusual. His justice had not been the system working. It had been the system working for the rare man it couldn't afford to fail, which is a very different thing. So, let me ask you honestly, because I read every comment. Have you ever had someone look at what you'd earned and decide you couldn't possibly have earned it? That you must have taken it, or faked it, or stolen it, before they knew a single thing about you? And be honest with yourself. How often do we glance at a stranger and quietly decide who they must be? Tell me below. That conversation is the whole reason a story like this matters. If this one moved you, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so the next story finds you. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.